A Japanese scout plane crossed the Caroline Islands in the first week of March 1945, climbed to better than 42,000 feet, and photographed 16 American aircraft carriers riding at anchor in a lagoon that did not appear on any chart the Imperial Navy trusted. The water sat 1,300 miles from Tokyo. It lay as far from San Francisco as San Francisco lies from London. No flag but the American one had ever flown over it, and 5 months earlier there had been nothing there at all but a coral reef and 40 low islets barely clear of the sea. The carriers were not passing through. They were being fueled, rearmed, patched, and fed in the middle of the Pacific Ocean by something that had no real precedent in the history of war. For most of that war, and for most of the centuries before it, a fleet was a thing that belonged to a harbor. Ships burned through their fuel and fired off their magazines and took damage, and then they went home, or to some fortified port with cranes and dry docks and fuel buried in the ground. And there they sat while men with welding torches and supply manifests made them whole. The reach of a navy was set by the distance back to that harbor. Everyone who thought about sea power understood this. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built 40 years of strategy on it. What the scout had photographed was the moment the rules stopped applying to the Americans. The lagoon was Ulithi, an atoll in the Western Carolines that the U.S. Navy had taken without a fight in September of 1944, and then turned into the largest naval base on the planet. It had no city. It had no permanent docks and almost no dry land. What it had was Service Squadron 10, several hundred vessels whose entire job was to keep the fighting fleet at sea and never let it come home. Oilers steamed out to meet the carriers a short run from their targets and refueled them while both ships moved. Repair vessels carried full machine shops. One of them ran an air-conditioned optical shop and stocked enough base metals that her crew could mill almost any part a wrecked ship needed. Floating dry docks had been towed across the ocean in sections, bolted back together in the lagoon, and made strong enough to lift a 45,000-ton battleship clear of the water. A barge moored among the islets turned out 500 gallons of ice cream a shift. Nimitz called the whole arrangement his secret weapon, and he meant it. The reason a lagoon full of ice cream barges amounted to a disaster for Japan ran all the way back to 1905 and to the battle that had shaped every Japanese flag officer's thinking ever since. At Tsushima, the Imperial Navy had wiped out a Russian fleet that reached far eastern waters exhausted after sailing most of the way around the globe to get there. The lesson taken from that day was simple, and for 2 generations of officers it went unquestioned. A fleet forced to travel a great distance to fight would arrive worn thin, and a smaller force waiting near home and when it rested and concentrated could destroy it in a single decisive engagement. This was the doctrine of kantai kessen, the decisive battle, and the shape of the entire Japanese fleet bent toward it. The Americans, the planners assumed, would have to come to them. They would grind west across 5,000 miles of ocean from Pearl Harbor and the West Coast, roped by a long and fragile cord to the yards where their ships were fixed and their tanks refilled. Japanese submarines were built for high surface speed, so they could race ahead of that advancing column and chew pieces off it. Cruisers and destroyers drilled at night torpedo work with the same purpose. Every element of it rested on one belief, that the enemy fleet would be far from its strength and getting weaker by the hour the 2 battle lines finally met. The floating base cut that cord. The Imperial Navy grasped the danger of the American carriers long before it grasped the machine that kept them running. As early as the spring of 1944, the Naval General Staff drew up a plan, codenamed Yugo, to throw the carrier force and 300 land-based aircraft at the American fleet where it gathered at Majuro in the Marshalls. Submarines would launch torpedo-armed amphibious tanks straight into the anchorage. The scheme won approval at the end of March from the Chief of the Naval General Staff and from Admiral Koga, who held command of the combined fleet. Days afterward, Koga's flying boat went down in a storm somewhere between Palau and Davao, and the plan died with the man who had signed it. A smaller version outlived him. Mitsuo Fuchida, the officer who had led the planes in over Pearl Harbor, pushed a more modest strike on Majuro, built around one careful reconnaissance flight. Everything hung on the scouts finding the fleet at its moorings. In early June, a long-range plane flew the route timed to arrive over Majuro at dawn on the very morning the attack was meant to open, and the observer counted 12 flat tops in the anchorage. The film went back to Fuchida. A second flight a few days later found the lagoon empty. Raymond Spruance had already led the fleet to sea to invade Saipan, and the carriers the Japanese hoped to catch napping at anchor lay 1,000 miles off, supplied wherever they happened to sail. After the Marianas fell and the Palaus were taken, the Pacific Fleet shifted its forward anchorage west to Ulithi, and headquarters in Japan started building yet another strike. By the opening of 1945, the plan had a name, Tan, and a bleak shape. The aircraft would fly almost 10 hours from Kyushu to the atoll, a one-way distance at the far edge of their fuel, and ram themselves into the carriers at anchor. The man who approved it, and approved it with real enthusiasm, was Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki. He had commanded the battleship Hyuga, had served as Yamamoto's chief of staff through the middle years of the war, and now ran the 5th Air Fleet from a field on Kyushu. Ugaki had watched the thing curdle from very close range. On the last day of 1944, he confided to his diary that ordinary people had at last understood how grave the situation was, only too late. What the Japanese could see of Ulithi came from a handful of scout planes flying out of Truk. By then a wrecked base in its own right, cut off, bombed flat, scraping together fuel and spare parts for the few machines still able to lift off. In mid-February, one of them climbed to over 42,000 feet above the atoll and found it almost bare. The observer did not bother loading the long focus camera in the tail and reported that anti-submarine nets now sealed the entrance to the lagoon, strung up after a midget submarine attack the previous November. 3 weeks on, the picture had changed past recognition. On the 5th of March, a scout brought home photographs of 16 flat-tops. On the 9th, another found 6 fleet carriers and 9 escort carriers at anchor, with a 4th cluster of ships standing in from the northeast. The fleet was there. It was simply there in a spot that 10 hours of one-way flight could barely reach. The intelligence was first-rate. It told the Imperial Navy in sharp photographic detail the exact location of the one place its weapons could not get to. 24 twin-engine bombers were gathered for the attack, a special unit assembled in a hurry during the first week of March. A submarine took station along the route to act as a radio beacon for the flyers, the same boat, as it turned out, whose captain would later put the torpedoes into the cruiser Indianapolis. The bombers carried enough fuel to reach the atoll and not a drop to come back, which the men who drew up the mission knew and accepted. Before the planes left, Ugaki spoke to the crews. He told them the hour was desperate, with American bombers over the home islands every day and Iwo Jima already lost, and that the duty placed on them was an honor. They lifted off from Kyushu on the morning of the 11th of March. The flight tore them apart. Engines failed and planes turned back or fell into the sea. Weather closed around formation. And of the 24 that started, only a few were still airborne by the time the light went. 2 reached the lagoon after dark and found it lit up, the ships at anchor showing more light than blackout discipline allowed. 1 bomber bored in low over the water and drove into the carrier Randolph at the stern, just under the flight deck, where a crowd of her sailors sat watching a movie on the hangar deck. The blast and the fire killed about 24 of them. The second machine crossed the atoll and crashed onto a small island called Sorlin, where it appears the pilot took a signal tower for the superstructure of a ship. The counts of the dead differ a little, 26 in some tallies and 27 in others, the gap being a few wounded men carried to the hospital ship Relief, who died aboard her soon after. In Tokyo, the news looked for a moment like a victory. The combined fleet's listening posts picked up American radio chatter in plain language about a raid on Ulithi, and Admiral Toyota, who held the supreme command afloat, let himself believe the strike had landed hard. The next day, a scout flew over the atoll once more. Every carrier still rode at anchor. No oil spread across the lagoon, no smear of fuel or wreckage marked where anything of weight had burned or gone down. The mission had cost the unit nearly everything it sent and killed a roomful of sailors at a movie, and it had not crossed a single ship off the American order of battle. What became of the Randolph after the fire is the whole thing in miniature. She was not sent home. There was no need to send her home because home, in every sense that counted to a damaged warship, had been carried out to the Western Pacific and parked in the lagoon. Repair crews went to work on her where she lay. They cut out and replaced something close to 29 tons of structural steel in her stern, rebuilt the hangar deck and the elevator framing and the supports beneath the flight deck, and laid down thousands of board feet of fresh lumber. Some of the steel they worked into her had been pulled from a Japanese sugar mill on Saipan, taken off the enemy a few months earlier and shipped to Ulithi as scrap. A little over 3 weeks after the kamikaze hit her, the Randolph stood out with the fleet for the invasion of Okinawa. One of the ship's officers said afterward that keeping her in the forward area to be rebuilt instead of crossing the ocean to a yard back in the States was the thing that let her finish the war in fighting trim. A passage home might have pulled her out of action for months. No one could say how many. Most people will never go looking for a story like this one, a base scrubbed off the public maps and a fleet that quietly stopped needing a harbor at all. Holding on to these accounts so they don't slip away for good is the reason this channel keeps running, and subscribing is the simplest way to help keep it running. The Imperial Navy spent 40 years preparing for one battle that would settle the war, and built a fleet, a submarine arm, and a whole generation of officers around the prospect of it. The battle demanded a single condition above all the rest, that the American fleet, when it finally came, would be far from home and weaker for the distance. By 1945, the Americans had stripped that condition out of the war. Their fleet was not far from home. It carried its home along with it, in the holds of several hundred unglamorous ships, and it did not grow weaker the deeper into the Pacific it pushed. Ugaki could find the fleet. His scouts photographed it down to the type of every carrier sitting in the lagoon. He could even reach across the ocean and burn a hole in one ship for the price of nearly everything he threw at it. What he could not do was the single thing the entire 40-year plan had been built to do, which was to meet the American fleet far from its strength, because the place that held its strength had become, by then, wherever the fleet chose to be.